Thank you. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about school development plans, some of the changes around the legislation, and also when we send the slides out to you, we've actually produced not an exemplar, but an example of what a decent one looks like. I try not to use the word what a good one looks like, but what a decent one looks like in line with the revised legislation, because I think it is important to point out that the legislation around school development plans have been updated that incorporates the regulations from 2014, but is now closely aligned to new school improvement guidance. The hyperlink in this actually takes you to that document. I'm not suggesting for 1 second as chairs of governors you go away and read that, but we're going to try and synthesize and bring some of those key points out for you so that it's understood. But essentially what the guidance will talk about are the key things that schools must do, which are underpinned by statutory obligations. And it's important to remind chairs of governors, obviously, that the school development plan is a legal document that must be put together and should take into consideration a range of evidence that for secondary schools includes public examination outcomes. Now, it's important to point out that whilst ESTIN no longer require a school or a setting to provide a formal self-evaluation report, robust self-evaluation is a key part of the development of a school development plan. So whilst head teachers and senior leaders may no longer provide a school self-evaluation report to governors, it is perfectly acceptable for you as chairs of governors and the governing body to expect that head teachers provide some kind of evidence base that indicate that this is the basis of how they've developed their school development plan. So ultimately, this is underpinned by the national mission. And whilst each school development plan is meant to be focused on their individual priorities and needs as a school community, there is recognition that learner progress must be central, both to Curriculum for Wales, but also the work of schools and settings in this way. So the two key things that there would be an expectation of school development plans to focus on would be learner progress and making sure that progress is relative to the principles of progression as set out in the four purposes, but also recognising the pace of that progress. And I think to a certain extent for secondary schools, having public examinations does provide a framework that gives that clear clarity. But we recognise that one of the challenges for secondary schools and also for primary schools is the autonomy and freedom around what does assessment look like from year 7 all the way through to year 9. But there is acknowledgement that SDPs consider national priorities, and from September 2022, these are very clearly set out as improving learner progress, supported by a range of knowledge, skills and experience, and also reducing the impact of poverty on learners' progression and also their attainment. So in terms of the work of evaluation improvement, all parts of the system will see self-evaluation as a mechanism for improvement, rather than because schools aren't doing good enough. It's more to do with that this continuous system of improvement, it should not be a means to an end. It should be a cyclical approach that focuses suitably on learner progress. It's not intended as a compliance exercise. So I know when we talk, and there's a couple of chairs and governors of schools I work with, and also the schools in Newport, the idea is that these documents are not meant to be a task and finish. They're meant to be live documents that are constantly edited throughout the year to reflect the needs of the school. And the expectation really of this is that schools will have honest, robust and evidence-based activities that support the priorities set out in the SDP. So we would expect, and the government would expect, that the SDP is based on a range of evidence and that all stakeholders contribute towards that. However, set out in law, whilst governors are legally responsible from a strategic perspective of school development plans, it is in most cases a recognition that that is a delegated responsibility to the head teacher, who then in turn works with the governing bodies to ratify that. And throughout the course of the year, there would be an expectation that governors would be seeking to establish the progress that schools are making towards their school development priorities. But part of the self-evaluation is identifying strengths and allowing the school to then contribute to system-wide improvement through that process. If we move on next, please, Ed. So in terms of establishing the priorities for the school, many of you now would have already had your first governing body meeting where you may indeed have signed off and ratified the school development priorities for the year. Obviously, we would expect, and it would be appropriate to expect, that the priorities are based on first-hand evidence, probably from the self-evaluation activities that the school would have done over the last academic year, and for secondary schools using some performance data to establish and test where there are strengths in the system of the school and also where there are contextually weaker performing subjects. Now, SDPs, however, should not be, and one of the people on the call just talked about then difficult questions, but they shouldn't be, priorities should not be based just on narrow measures such as learner attainment. They need to be on a capturing a wide range of things. So the school's own priorities, there is a legal requirement that plans must be published on school websites. However, the summary of that plan needs to be published, not necessarily the full document. Now, some schools might want to publish the full document, which is perfectly fine, but there is no expectation that the full document is there, because some of that might be information that you may not necessarily want to publish in the wider domain. The publication of the SDP is designed really to support a culture of openness and transparency where all aspects of the middle tier are able to provide support, but it's designed in a non-judgmental way. So what we've got now, if you move on, please, Ed, is just an example of a school. Now, you'll get a copy of these slides, and no one's expecting you to zoom in and look at these now, but you'll get a copy of the slides and also a anonymized copy of this 3-year school improvement plan that outlines those priorities. Now, obviously, one of the things that you would hope for is that as a school is going to have probably 4, maybe 5 priorities over a 3-year period. And then within each of those priorities, you can see in this particular school, within student progress and achievement, there are milestones that are set out as measurements of success. So against the first strategic priority, looking at standards of achievement being consistently to exceed expectations that are set against the school's own tracking and monitoring system, making sure that all groups of learners achieve relative to their ability, that there's opportunities in students will demonstrate highly effective skills, and that gaps in attainment between different groups of learners will be below the local and national averages, and potentially between the family averages as well. So within this model, what we'll then do is just give you an example then of what one of these areas will look like. So if you can just move on to the next slide, please, Ed. So within this, you'll be able to see for this particular school that the school has then broken down this first strategic objective, and within that then highlighting measurements of how the school will be successful. You can see there that there's clearly in the top left right hand corner, you can see that there is a designated member of the leadership team who might have responsibility for this, and you might have a designated governor. This school has a designated governor who is responsible for overseeing and tracking the progress of student progress and achievement. Now, in this particular school, the designated governor would meet with the relevant member of the leadership team on a termly basis and just get an update on progress, and then they would report back to the full governing body. So that is the system of how this governing body works to give clarity over strategic leadership. You'll also be able to see that within the area of this part of the work, the school is given a rationale as to why it's important. Why is student progress and achievement important? It's not designed to be rocket science, but ultimately it's explaining why it matters. And then beyond that, then you'll be able to see that in the right-hand box, there's that slight evaluation of performance in the previous academic year. So in this particular school, 2 clear areas of focus. The first one about raising standards in a very few subjects. You've got art, English literature and language, health and social and childcare, and Spanish. Those subjects were identified by this particular school as Ed's talked about in terms of the ALPS, as having an ALPS score lower than 4. So in this particular school, anything that's got an ALPS score lower than 4 then was identified as a priority. And you'll see then that there are steps that the school is trying to take to address that. But also based on evidence from learning and teaching reviews and work scrutiny, you'll see that a very few students' presentation and care of their work is an area for development, and also then to improve the standard of collaboration skills for a very few students who are too passive in lessons. And you'll then be able to see the clarity of how these actions, so in the table there, and you'll be able to see it in more detail in your leisure, a various range of actions against each of these 4 measurements of success against individuals who are named individuals who've got responsibility for this. And you'll see then the clarity of how these actions will be monitored. So, for example, to look at the standard of achievement, you'll see that for example, at a governing body level, there will be reports provided to the Curriculum and Standards Subcommittee. That will be on a termly basis. So regular updates of interim performance and monitoring and tracking performance to show how well this school is going to be making progress. Again, as Ed said, so there are no surprises in the summer to see whether or not that performance is there or not. Moving on to the last slide then, we then see an example of what the expected progress looks like. And in this scenario, you can see that as a result of these actions, this school is saying that they would expect the standards achieved by all groups of students in public exams to exceed expectations over a sustained period, that high standards by all groups of abilities would be seen through work scrutiny. So it's very clearly evidence-based as to how we will track this work and how we'll monitor it, but more importantly, what would the expected progress look like? Now, obviously, based on the changes of legislation around accountability, it may not be appropriate to say we would have X percentage or the cap point score would be this or that, but it would be useful to get a feel so that making expected progress, which ultimately is what we would expect a good school to do, to at least make expected progress, that is something that can be measured because the school would use a range of data to look at that. So ultimately, the idea of this document, and we'll send you the full version of this, this was just an example of some of the key things that you need to cover. But moving on, though, 2 things that are now in the legislation. There is an expectation as to each school development plan must make reference to the progress of the previous academic year. Now, obviously, in addition to my work as a principal school improvement partner, I'm actually a serving head as well. And therefore, my advice that I give to head teachers is very much try not to create additional work. How schools do this will vary. But ultimately, this is an example where the head teacher has used the information that has been shared with the full governing body in their head teacher report and more or less copy and pasted that information into this document. So it's not duplicating that work. Ultimately, one of the things is that we're trying to look after head teacher wellbeing workload, but it's utilising the information that is available from Qualifications Wales to make meaningful comparisons. So this section of the report will also highlight information. You can see at the very bottom, just the performance of different groups of learners to indicate how well then those children are performing commensurate with the information that's available from the government level. Other things that it will also include, if you go on, please, Ed, is an explanation of the grant spend. But the slight caveat here is that I was talking to one head teacher in the EES recently, and their approach to it was going to be slightly different. Obviously, what this doesn't do, this particular example, just gives a very high level overview of how the grant money is spent against each. This is, for example, the student or the pupil development grant expenditure. Ultimately, this is a high level analysis of how this money is spent. However, what that doesn't do is replace the Excel document that head teachers complete along with their business managers, along with their school improvement partners. One alternative could be that in this document, whilst there has to be a legal requirement to acknowledge these grants, it may be please refer to a separate document, and that document is saved within the school setting upload in Hub. So these are just examples of how it's done. It's designed to be a framework. Again, the SDP spend must also be on a school website. That is also a legal requirement, but it's just to give you an idea about how that is done in order to simplify the process, in order to give you an example of what a decent one looks like. So I don't know if there's any specific questions around school development plans, whether you want to put something in the chat feature or if there are any particular questions, but it's a bit of a whistle stop to give you an example of that. And we will share out a full 3-year plan as an example, not as something that must be copied or replicated, but just to give you an idea of the sort of things that you would expect to see to help you in your work in quality assuring the work of the school on a strategic level.
Thanks, Ed. This is going to be a very quick summary of the key points that you need to be aware of as Chair of Governors relating to head teacher performance management. What I will say is there is a full professional learning session recording available for you to access if you wanted to get more detail or wanted to have a bit more of a refresher. And the link for that is contained in these slides. So you will have access to that as well as on the Governor's website. So whilst the focus here is on the performance management process for the head teacher, I think as chairs of governors, it's important that you do have an understanding of the performance requirements for all performance management requirements for all staff within the school. So this slide just gives you an overview of what is statutory under the School Teacher Appraisal Wales regulation. So you'll see that it's statutory for anybody who is a teacher or on that leadership teaching terms and conditions to have performance management on an annual basis. There are a few exceptions. So you might have some people who are employed on short-term contracts or supply for less than a term. They wouldn't be required to have a performance management process. If you've got any NQTs, obviously there's a separate induction process for them, which would take precedent, and any teachers you have who are subject to the school's capability policy. Whilst it's not statutory for support staff, it would be considered as best practice that there is performance management going on for them as well. And my recommendation is you would follow a very similar process for that. So that might just be something that you might want to check that is happening within your schools. Thanks, Ed. So just to give you a little overview of what the key performance management requirements are on governors, you can see that there's a requirement on you as governing bodies to review and agree the school performance management policy on an annual basis. Now, this is a regional policy that's been developed across all 5 local authorities and commended to schools. So we do automatically review that on your behalf and would recommend any amended policies to you if there are amendments required. But it's just to make sure that you're signing that off on an annual basis. You're required to determine the timing of the appraisal cycle for the head teacher, and this normally in most circumstances in line with the appraisal regulations would be for a 1-year cycle and would begin sometime in the autumn term. So it has to begin after the 1st of September and before the 31st of December as stated in the regulations, unless there are specific circumstances where the local authority and governing body agree otherwise. I know there were some, obviously, back in when we had sort of COVID and the lockdowns and everything, but by now you would have expected that schools would have started going back in alignment for that with those timescales. There's a requirement on you to appoint the appraisal panel, ensure that that is carried out in line with statutory requirements. So the appraisal panel would need to just report back just to confirm that the performance management process has happened with the head teacher, not to share the details though with the full governing body. And also you'd expect the head teacher to be reporting back to you so that you can ensure that teachers' performance management is also carried out in line with statutory requirements. With regards to the appraisal panel, just a little bit of a refresher is that the head teacher performance management is carried out by a panel of at least 2 governors appointed by the governing body, and then you would have 1 or 2 appraisers appointed by the local authority. Now, within the region, this is usually the SIP. They would normally play the part of that local authority representative, and they will obviously be there as well to advise and guide the panel through the process should they have any particular questions, and they can talk through relevant data and performance evidence if the panel members wish them to. One key point is that the SIP is part of the panel, and therefore in line with those regulations, they have to be present for all stages of the process. So where you're having a meeting to set objectives or to review progress against those objectives as part of the formal process, then you need to ensure that the SIP is invited to those meetings as well. Obviously, with schools that have a religious character or a voluntary aided, there can be one additional appraiser who's a foundation governor appointed by the diocesan authority, but it's one of the key points there as well. Obviously, no member of staff at the school can be appointed as an appraiser of the head teacher. Thanks, Ed. So just to quickly run through what the role of that appraisal panel is. as you can see from the slide, that there's some key elements that they'll be required to undertake. So they need to be meeting with the head teacher to undertake the annual performance review and agree the objectives for the next cycle. In practice, this tends to happen in the one meeting where you review last year's objectives and the progress, and then set those objectives for the next cycle. As part of that process, they would be required to scrutinise any school performance data or any other relevant information in preparation for that review meeting. The appraisal panel is required to make sure that that annual cycle of performance and monitoring and review is taking place and working with the head teacher. And I think it's really important that this is a collaborative process. So, the head teacher is fully engaged in the process. And it's optional, but it is recommended that prior to meeting with the head teacher, we'd recommend that the panel meet to determine the arrangements and review the data and any other information that's been provided to you in advance as well. So just a little bit of an overview of what head teacher objectives should really reflect. So we're looking at setting objectives, and this isn't about itemizing every activity or task, but it's about picking out the key expectations and the developmental priorities for that head teacher. So you're looking at having performance management objectives that align to your school development plan and reflect the requirements of the professional standards, as well as having taken into account the head teacher's professional aspirations as well. So professional learning is a key part of those professional standards, and you would expect that the head teacher's objectives would have generally at least one objective in there that is focused around their professional learning as well. And the key is to discuss how that learning then will also benefit the school. So the slide just gives you a little bit of an overview of the sort of things you might want to consider when discussing objectives with the head teacher. Moving on to the monitoring of performance then, the arrangements for monitoring performance against those objectives should be discussed and agreed during that planning meeting and then recorded by the appraisal panel on that statement of objectives. So you want to have a discussion with the head teacher about including a variety of methods on how you're going to be able to get information to see how they're progressing against their objectives. So that could be progress against the school development plan. It could be their own sort of practice review and development records, school performance information. What's really important is that there is sufficient appropriate evidence that will be gathered over that 12-month period so that you as a panel, or the appraisal panel, can ensure secure judgments are made. And again, as part of that process, your SIP will be there to be able to advise you and guide you on some monitoring procedures that could be considered as well. And then once you've done the monitoring, obviously you've got that annual performance review as well. And the purpose of this is for the appraisal panel to consider the extent to which that head teacher has met their objectives and whether or not there's been successful overall performance in relation to the professional standards. So like I said earlier, the performance review is likely to be combined with agreeing objectives for the following performance management cycle and any wider discussions held regarding that school development plan and relevant school performance information. So the date on which the appraisal review is to be held will be determined by the appraisal panel, but there is a requirement to give at least 10 school days notice to the head teacher of that date. In reality, it's normally agreed collaboratively with the head teacher, and head teachers tend to take quite a lead role in their own performance management, but that's just the requirements of the regulation. And the expectation is that the head teacher will have done their own self-analysis as part of that review, and the likelihood is they're going to provide you with a whole host of information in that meeting as well of how they've performed against their objectives. And just moving on to just the final slide, really, in terms of recording the performance management process. Again, these are requirements of the regulations, and there is a requirement to record the outcome of the review on an appraisal statement. So this will record the main points made at the review meeting and the conclusions reached in terms of whether or not objectives have been met, partially met, not met. There'll also be a statement then of the new head teacher performance management objectives and also a statement around professional learning needs and an indication of how those might be met, including then with regards to the objectives, what monitoring you'll be doing. Now, there are templates to support the recording of all of the performance management process included in the model policy that will have been commended to your schools. So there's no requirement for you to create your own. You can just access those templates that are there. And finally, as I said, there is further information. That was a real whistle-stop tour of head teacher performance management. There's a lot more to it than what I've obviously gone through this evening. But to provide a little bit more, if you did want to access it, there is a link, like I said, to a recording on the slide there that you can access to get a little bit more information around the sort of questions you might want to consider as with the other processes covered tonight, but also, you know, what the main elements of the process are. So hopefully that just gave a little bit of a refresher. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to take those now.